What's up, BT Podcasts? Man, I'm excited about today's conversation. It's going to be a good one. Today we have a very special guest. We have Pastor Mat Moreno from BT Alice campus. Matt, say what's up to everybody tuning in.
What's up, everybody? Excited to be here today. Thanks for having me, Danny.
Yeah, it's going to be good. Just as you guys are tuning in, however you're listening to, maybe it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, maybe you're watching on YouTube. My hope is that this conversation blesses you and that you would share it with people. And today's topic is going to be very good. But before we kind of get into today's specific conversation, what I would love to do, Matt, you've been a part of the BT for a minute, for a couple of years now, but maybe there's several people that don't really know your story. You know, Alice is about, an hour and a half away from the McAllen campus, and it's one of our newer kind of campuses. And so maybe what I would love to do is kind of you start by sharing your story, man. Like, how did you get saved? How did you experience salvation? What was your call to ministry like? Just kind of start there for us, bro.
Yeah, so I grew up in Aransas Pass, Texas, so small town right off the coast. Probably became famous a little bit after Harvey hit that area. And so born and raised there. Mom still lives there along with all my siblings live around in that area. So grew up in a little bit later in life in First Baptist Aransas Pass. And so got saved at an illusionist in Corpus. And so we went for an event, and I went because this other girl went. So I was like,
Wait, pause. What you got saved what?
At an illusionist.
At an illusionist?
Yeah.
So like an event?
Yeah, so like an event. So
like in student ministry?
Yeah, like in student ministry. So I was in junior high, actually. And so we went out there, and it was a really cool time. And at the end, the dude gave, the salvation prayer and gave a call. And I repeated it in my head, and I was sitting there, and I was like, man, he said, stand up if you said that, like we say almost every Sunday. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going to stand up. I'm not going to do it. And so he's counted to 3, and I stood up, and I didn't even know I stood up. Like, I opened my eyes and I'm standing up. And so, the illusionist kind of illusioned me to stand up in that opportunity there. And so,
He illusioned you. That's awesome.
Yeah.
How old were you during this time?
I was around 13, so I was in junior high. So 7th or 8th grade, I don't remember the specifics, but it was after that, followed God for a little bit through high school, went to camp my freshman year and really felt the call to ministry there. So I was at Zephyr. I remember sitting in the bunk. I think it was Cinsa before they were all fancy like they are now. The little ones where you could barely fit in the restroom. And so I remember sitting on the top bunk, and I told my group leader, like, hey, I really feel this call to full-time ministry. I didn't know what the heck that meant. Like, he explained it to me a little bit. And it's funny because then when we got back from camp, if you've been around BT for a while, Pastor Marshall, who was our old executive pastor. He was the senior pastor there at First Baptist Aransas.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that's
and
cool.
so I told him, and so he kind of explained it to me, and then like any kid who gets called to ministry at that age, I decided to run from it till about college, a little bit after my second year in college, and then really felt the call back of God saying, like, hey, I want to use you. So ended up joining an internship program at a church in Corpus, and then the rest from there is history. So grew up in there, started as an intern doing community groups. Went from community groups to student ministry, did student ministry for a long while, and then in 2015 became a campus pastor.
Wow, nice.
And so was pastoring a church in Alice too at the same time there for the next 3 years. And then of course in 2018 I think it was that they ended up closing that church there in Alice. And so after that closed, we didn't know what we were going to do. We had 3 months to kind of figure things out. We looked for different places, and it was really kind of going into the story here, but it was really about a week later that the team from BT came down. It was Chris and the whole leadership team, and talked about starting something in Alice.
Cool.
It was so fresh. We're talking about failure, and it kind of really did feel like I failed during that time. And so I was like, no, like I'm not ready to do this again.
Yeah, no, I got you. Yeah, and we'll get to that part of your story here in a second. Backtracking a little bit, so you got saved at an illusionist event. Do you remember what kind of trick the illusionist did?
The only thing I remember, it was like boxes in the shape of a cross, but like he was like inside the boxes, and like they were moving him around like he didn't have any body parts or something. I don't know, something weird. Like that. Yeah, with like mirrors and stuff, and that's all I remember.
All right, I'm just praying that it was real for you, bro.
Yeah,
no, I'm just kidding. That's awesome, man. I loved hearing just the transition of your story. That so you didn't grow up in church then?
No, I didn't grow up in church.
Got you. Cool.
It wasn't until I grew up in a very religious church early on in life. So I always knew of God. Really started questioning that and kind of what that was, and then ended up in First Baptist Aransas. And really, that's where my faith really took off, was there. So.
Oh, I love that. And then it's crazy. I didn't know that Pastor Marshall was, I guess, your senior pastor.
Yeah.
And then that, kind of little bit of a full circle there for a little while. Man, that's great. And so now we'll get into certain parts of your story here in a little bit that I'd love for you to kind of just open up and share about. And as you alluded to a while ago, the conversation that we're going to talk about today, that I think maybe a lot of people deal with, but maybe a lot of people don't want to maybe admit that this is a struggle or something like that. But it's the conversation of how to deal with failure. And for a lot of people tuning in, maybe you don't have that issue because you live a perfect life, and so you actually never deal with failure, right? But for so many of us, it's like we walk through these moments where we maybe make these decisions or we try this thing, and then maybe we end up failing at that thing, and the effects of failure can really be deep in how we really live our lives. And for us as believers and as called to ministers, how we effectively do ministry. And so we'll kind of get into that conversation here a little bit. But now you're this part of your ministry where God has you now is you're overseeing BT Alice. And so, man, I'd love for you to just kind of share some stories, like what's going on in Alice right now, what's been the kind of timeline, maybe even quickly, like in 2 minutes, give us like the short story of how it started versus how it's going, So give us that for BT Alice, bro.
Yeah, so BT Alice, we just celebrated 3 years there in Alice. And so started out in Coastal Bend College with some vision nights. Ended up being at the Boys and Girls Club on Sunday nights for about 3 months. After that, we found our home at the Armory, which is an old military type thing. And so we were meeting there for 2.5 years, pretty much. And so we were there for a long while. That was our home. We loved it. It was a great, very intimate setting. Then we started having some conversations with the Presbyterian church in town. They were getting ready to close. And so we started having conversations with them. What would it look like if we moved in? So time passed a little bit. Then we went back and had more conversations with them. And so now we own that building. So we are in the old Presbyterian church in Alice, 77 North Adams Street, right behind the police station.
Hey, if you're in Alice,
pull up. If you're in Alice, come join us. And so it's an amazing thing, man. The teams who worked on the building, the contractor, did an amazing job with everything. And so the coolest thing is I always wanted or had the vision or kind of the idea, right, of being a kind of more modern church inside of an old church. And that's really what it is. You look at it from the outside, it looks like your old, normal, like traditional church. The inside still looks like that too, but once worship starts, I mean, it's BT,
Yeah,
and so
that's cool.
It's really cool, and so it's a great environment. Very different from the Armory where we were. We had the lights off, the music stuff. Here, there's windows everywhere, and so it's light, so you're worshiping in the light, and so it's really just an amazing thing, man. Since we started BT Alice, we've seen marriages transform, we've seen lives transformed. Like, we've just seen a crazy move of God, especially here in these past few months since moving into the building, right? There's people who we're going to talk about here in a little bit who were hurt by a previous church, whether in the community or something, and they're falling in love with the church again. They never lost their faith, but they just lost faith in God's house, and so we're seeing that come back and then begin to get plugged in and to flourish and things like. So we're seeing a lot of that, and so it's been really cool. In the past 2 weeks, we've had 8 baptisms, and so for a church our size, that's huge.
That's good.
And 6, 7, 8, 9 salvations, and so
and I think stats show that like a lot of churches won't even see 10 baptisms for the year. And God's doing big things with you guys there in Alice, and it's a phrase we love throwing around, but it's a phrase that we truly believe that God has big plans for you guys there at BT Alice, and so I'm excited to see that play out, man. And I've gotten to see the building, man. If you're a part of BT and you go to another campus, maybe Edinburgh, Sharyland, McAllen, I'll challenge you guys: take a Sunday, drive to Alice, worship with that community, because that is our community. And I love what you said, that it's a traditional church that feels modern inside, but then the other thing you said was, but inside is BT, and I love that, because that's really the goal for us as BT Church is, no matter where a campus is, that it feels like BT, that it has our same DNA, our same culture. And you can copy and paste a system, but one of the hard things to do is copy and paste a culture. And I feel like for you guys, you all do an amazing job of taking the DNA and the vibe of BT and making it happen there in Alice. And so, man, it's a beautiful thing. Last question for that: what is your hope for the city of Alice?
Man, honestly, my hope for the city of Alice is one thing, it's really been radiant on my heart lately. It's just that they would know that God hasn't forgotten about them. This past weekend we talked about the in-between, right? Meeting God and the grace in the in-between, how that story that we shared, and how he was in between when he met those lepers. You know what I mean? It wasn't in one of the big cities. No, it was in a village. And oftentimes I feel like Alice is a village, right? We're between San Antonio and Corpus. We're between San Antonio and, the valley, the bigness of the valley. And so that's just my prayer, is that people who are in Alice feel, and the surrounding areas, right? The cities that are around it, that they feel and they know that they're not forgotten, right? That God does have a big plan for them. You know what I mean? And that they would truly tap into that and get plugged into his house and know that he is good and know that he is better, right? And just watch him transform their lives. That's what we're seeing. Just a quick side note, man, we've got probably about 30 people, 25 to 30 people that are driving in from Freer. Literally 45 minutes away.
I was about to ask, how far is that?
From Alice, and they're driving in from Freer, you know what I mean? And so
Pastor Nick always says, a church alive is worth a drive.
Yeah. So, and that's what we're seeing. Like, honestly, is just God moving not only in the big cities, right? Yes, we want to reach people in the big cities, but the smaller towns around count too. Like, God hasn't forgotten about them. And
it's funny you say that. This reminded me of, whenever I was able to do church plant in New York City, we lived in a neighborhood called Astoria. The neighborhood we planted the church is called Woodside. It was right next to it. And Astoria is a very vibrant, everybody loves Astoria. And they had stores and markets, and they had like merch of Love Astoria, We Heart Astoria. Like, it was such a lovable thing. And I remember one time we sat in a meeting with our staff and our dream team there. And we're just thinking like how can we bring that same love to Woodside? Because like you were saying with Alice, like it almost like feels forgotten.
Yeah.
And that's when the phrase "Love Woodside" kind of came into fruition for Queen's Church, and it was just really cool to see that. But that's that same idea, is like, hey, like, we see you, and I feel like what you're doing with Alice is telling the community, we're planted here. Yeah. We bought this building. We're right downtown.
We're not going anywhere.
We're here, and we see you. So I love that. So now from a personal level, kind of getting into this topic. So today we're talking about how to deal with failure. It's something that everybody's going to go through at some point. And, nobody's perfect. And so we're always going to have moments of maybe we try something, we go after something. It starts off like when you're young, you go after like a sport, a game, an activity. But then even as you get older, you become a young adult, you're choosing a school to go to, you're choosing a career to go after, a calling to go after. But starting this way, in your personal life, are you a goal setter? Like maybe like in January, beginning of the year, you set goals, stuff like that. Is that something you do personally?
Yeah, sometimes I'm not very good at getting those goals.
Right, you're good at writing them down.
Yeah, good at writing them down. Yeah,
it's like all of us.
Then you forget about them. March comes around, April comes around. You're like, hey, what about them goals?
Or January 10th comes around.
You're like, hey, what about those goals? So yeah, I would say to a sense, I am a goal setter. There was a part of my life where I was super driven by goals, and I honestly just let it consume my life. And so like since then, I've had to learn like the healthy balance between setting goals, right, and honestly just kind of taking my time too with certain things. You know, some things are immediate, but some things aren't. Sometimes they have the longer game ahead, and so
that's good. I'm a big goal setter, but I'm the same way. Like sometimes I'll set a goal that's like way, like I know I'm not going to reach it, but I'm just going to try anyway. One time, because I love reading, one time I set a goal, I want to read 100 books in a year. And I even like made a list. I wrote down every single book that I was going to read, and I didn't get it. I got like 60 or 61, something like that. And I remember at that moment, like, man, like I only got like 60% of the way. Like there's 40% of what I didn't do. I felt like a failure for a moment. And then there's like this reality of I didn't reach my goal, but then like my mind had a slight adjustment of, well, I did read 60 books, and that's like for me, like that's the first time I had ever done that.
It's more than one a week.
So you kind of see the tension there, and that's kind of what I want to go after. So a question I have for you is this: is would you rather try something crazy? For some people, maybe reading 100 books is not that crazy, but something that's a crazy, wild goal to go after. Would you rather try something crazy and fail, or do things at a minimal risk?
I had a mentor one time, kind of on the same subject, and she said, if you're not taking risks, then you're not leading.
Wow.
Right. And so I've always kind of held on to that. Right. So like I'm going to take big risks, and hey, you might fail, but at least you're leading through that failure. You're leading through the risk too. And so I would say, I like to take risks. Sometimes maybe try things that people say, oh, well, that didn't work in the past, or that hasn't worked in a while. Well, let's see if it'll work now. There was anyway. So
have you ever failed at anything before?
No, bro, I'd never failed at nothing.
Cool.
Yeah.
Let's continue on.
No, There was one time that I did this big volunteer appreciation, bro. Like inflatables, like had the drinks ready, like burgers, everything. Like planned this whole thing out. We were like, oh man, 75 of our dream teamers are gonna show up, and bro, like 10 showed up.
Oh,
like,
man.
and I'm like, bro, I thought I made this a big deal. But
what'd you do with the leftover burgers?
Yeah, we just gave them to the police officers.
Oh, that's a good thing. See, God had a plan for that.
So we had a plan for
that.
that. Yeah.
It's a running joke with like me and Summer and some of our friends, Gabe and Sam. I always say, like, for any event that we do, I'm like, no one's gonna come. Yeah. Like, for any time we have like a youth event or young adults or anything when I was a student pastor or stuff like that. But that's always like a feeling I have, like, no one's gonna come to this, because the first time when I got the opportunity to do student ministry, which was actually by Pastor Chris, when I was serving with him. We had set up like a Disciple Now type of youth event. And I remember like promoting it, and we had we're a small church. We had maybe like 10 students sign up, and I was like, all right, it's our first time. I'm super excited. It's going to be great. Like, we'll just see what happens. 0 students showed up that Friday night. And I was like, man, this is the worst feeling ever. And I remember thinking like, what do I do? And then, what happened was, like, after we realized nobody was coming, Chris and I just went to Chili's, and we just kind of like talked, because I was just like, I need somebody to hang out with, man. Because it's just that feeling. And you even think about that, like, why does failure feel like the worst thing ever? And so you wrestle with that. And so what I want to talk about with it is, how do we deal with failure? How do we, a lot of people use the phrase like failing forward, or learning from your failure type of thing. And so, thinking about setting a type of goal or going after a big risk, like you were saying, what are ways that maybe you've done that and you've kind of like learned from that, or how did you deal with that personally? Yeah,
so I would say kind of like, fear can be paralyzing, if you let it.
The fear of failure.
The fear of failure. And so kind of looking at situations and things and knowing like, hey, sometimes you're going to set some big goals, right? And even though you might not meet them, like, still look at how much you did. Like you said, you had the goal of reading 100 books, right? You read 60, right? Which is still a big deal. And so I would say it's just kind of knowing, and I wouldn't say going in with the mindset that, I'm going to fail, so it's going to be okay anyway. You know what I mean? But like going in and giving it everything you have, and knowing, especially in ministry, man, there's certain things and that we can do, or, big events, like you said, conferences and things we want to put on. And then we're like, well, man, I hope people show up. Right. You know what I mean? But even if one person shows up and they hear Christ, like, wow. Like, that matters, that one person matters. And so there's been times where we've done, certain events, and it's like 5 people showed up, and I'm like, man, I can feel discouraged about that 5, or I can know, like you said, like, God has a purpose and a plan for these 5 who are here, and their life can still be changed. I think it's like, you're a preacher, and so it really doesn't matter where you go preach at, right? There could be one person in the room, there could be 100 people in the room, there can be 200 people in the room, right? You're still going to preach with the same message and the same passion, right? And not being afraid to kind of fail at the end. If that makes sense. I don't even know if I went on a rabbit trail.
No, that's good. That's really good. And I think that goes into this question I want to ask is how can we see failure differently? Because I think like some of the stuff you're pointing out is like these, like, from the outside perspective, like numerical goals. And it's really hard because we look at maybe what other churches are doing, what other events are doing, and we see like, they had 1,000 people, but we had 10. And then because of that comparison, then we feel like failures. And so how can we see it differently is definitely a healthy way to approach this. I want to kind of get into your story a little bit. You kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier, but there was an episode in your ministry where you have shared with me that it made you feel like a failure. Kind of talk about that for a little bit. Yeah. So, there, like, we talked about like what came into ministry, and I think it was 2009. And so from 2009 to, no, not 2009, 2000, anyway, the years don't matter. But for about 7 to 8 years, right, I was serving at this church. I was on staff at the church. And so the last 4 years there, 3 to 4 years there, I was a campus pastor. A lot similar to what I do now, but not really. It was more video driven than live preaching. And so those 3 to 4 years, we went and God took the church and turned it around. Right. It started growing. It was in Alice. Yeah. Okay, in cool. Alice still. Yeah. So God was moving. Lives were being changed. People were being saved. You know what I mean? It went from not that many people to quite a few people. You know what I mean? There came a day where the church leadership decided that the church was losing too much money to continue on. Okay. And so from one day to the next, it was closed. From one day to the next?
From one day to the next. Yeah. So it was a meeting on Wednesday to that Sunday that basically, like, they decided the church was going to close because it was losing too much money, and so you had to cut it off.
About how many people were y'all running?
By that time, we were around 250 to 300, maybe a little bit more. And so we were running 4 services, Saturday night, 3 on Sunday. Definitely, lots. Just had a brand new worship center built, kind of just specifically for the church. Renovated the kids area, right? It was super nice and all that. And so again, from one day to the next. And so after that,
walk us through what was it, like a phone call that you got, that an email, hey, you guys got to shut down. What was that?
It was a meeting that I was called into. So Monday there was one meeting that was like, hey, your campus is losing so much money. We got to turn this around. So we came up with a plan. Like, okay, I'm gonna have a state of the church type meeting. We're gonna talk about where we're at. Challenge people to give and stuff. To being called in Wednesday and it being like, hey, we just can't let this go on anymore type thing. Here's your paperwork. Look over it, sign it. But we're gonna announce it Sunday. We're not gonna have Saturday services. We're gonna have only 2 services on Sunday to kind of explain the whole thing type thing. And so it was like, okay,
wow.
Really didn't have a say in it. I was just the campus pastor at the time. And so it was like, okay, so Sunday came, probably one of the worst days of my life. Honestly, it was one of those days where my mom and dad were like, hey, you want me to be there? And I'm like, yeah, probably not. You know what I mean?
Man,
and, there's pictures of the last service there and things that we did. People, of course, were heartbroken. They were sad. They were mad, too, just because it was honestly just a blindside to kind of what was taking place there. We had seen a movement of God happen, and now it was like, hey, sorry. You know what I mean? And so after that, I honestly, like you said, I felt like a failure, man.
Wow.
Like, we stayed living in Alice. After that, we had about 3 months to figure things out of what we wanted to do and where we were going to go. And I was driven, man. I'm getting out of Alice. You know what I mean? Like, God shut this door. We're done type thing. Like, I can't stay here. Like, I went so hard, pushing, for this church. And now here, I'm going to have to pick up and like, I'm going to start something else here. Like, nah, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it was just heartbreaking. And kind of, again, I felt like a failure. I would go to HEB and I would literally think people were looking at me like, oh, that's that pastor who had that church and it failed. Like, that's literally what it felt like everywhere I went.
So then you started doing curbside.
Yeah, so then I started doing curbside. Yeah, because I'm like, I don't want to go inside. People are going to look at this guy. And, and so honestly, we kind of became hermits from that, right? We wouldn't go out to eat, really, really do much. Like, failure really kind of paralyzed us in that. And so I'll kind of go on. But when we had the opportunity, to begin to partner with BT, and BT was there the week after, like, everything happened.
What was that? Did Pastor Chris just like text you, or what was that communication like?
So it was through Marshall and Pastor Louie, because I had relationships with both of them. They came out, and honestly, the first conversation was like, how are you doing? Like, they cared more about my soul. They cared more about me and my wife, how we were processing things. And honestly, it was like a check-in on me to see how we're doing. And then past that, then it was like, hey, we want to do something in Alice, right? Chris will share the story. It's been on his heart for years, even before that happened, to be there. At that time I was like, yeah, I'm not going to stay, but I'll help you. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Chris bleeds Alice orange.
Yeah, he's a coyote through and through. You know what I mean? Number one, here we go.
Yeah.
And so, from there, there was multiple kind of steps and other things that took place where still, 2 months later, we were still like, hey, I'm out of here. You know what I mean? Like, I couldn't. Like, there was, and now I can look back, right, and see and say, well, part of it was pride, and part of it was fear that was paralyzing me. Because, like I said, I don't want to start another church here and be going so hard for this, and then remember, like, hey, that's the pastor who failed with that last church. Like, this one's just going to do the same thing.
Wow.
You know what I mean? Like, it was that same thing, and the whole time, like, I really had to focus on God and what He was calling us to do, and trying to hear His voice over everybody else's voice and telling us, hey, you need to go here, or hey, you need to do this, or hey, what do you think about this? Type thing. And so BT just did a really good job of loving us after we were hurt, right, and helping us heal through that. Right. They could have, it was crazy. I mean, I told you the story too. There was multiple times where he said, no, we're going to leave Alice type thing. And they still loved us so well that it was just like crazy. Like, I don't even know how to explain it. You know what I mean? But it was just the love that we felt through that process, that when it came down to it, another opportunity, a door was closed. And really just praying through it. And me and my wife looked at it and said, if we're going to stay here, right, and oftentimes this is for free, oftentimes God will speak through your wife, right?
Yeah.
And so she looked at me and
Come
she
on.
said, what if God's calling us to stay here and BT's the church? Right? This was after we had already came down and visited. We experienced the service. We experienced the culture. We could see that BT was different, right? And we could see that Chris was different. Louis, you know, the whole staff. It was just a different type of thing that we had never really been a part of. And so it was after that we were like, yeah, let's do this. You know what I mean? Like I had to be willing to put my pride aside and leave the fear behind, right? But then a new fear crept in. Is like, dude, what if nobody shows up? Like here we are starting this new church, and what if nobody shows up because it's me, the guy who had the failed church, you know? And so, but honestly, since then, you know, I just had to press in to God and just know like,
That's
hey,
good.
this is on him. This is his church. This is not my church. This is not Chris's church, right? We're just going to continue. We're doing what we're called to do. We're going to stay faithful to God. We're going to stay faithful to his word. We're going to teach that. We're going to help reach people and show people that, right? And so we started with the great core group, man. And it was crazy. Like the people that I thought would not want to be a part of a church again with me, you know what I mean? Like here they were, and they were ready to go, right? They had seen and felt what had happened, right? But there was still lots of people who were out there hurting, and still to this day, we're seeing some of them come back and just really fall in love with God's house again. And so
I love that, man. Powerful story. You still, do you go to HEB now again, or
I go to HEB now again. I go there a lot. So it's my favorite place. They take half my paycheck.
That's true.
Direct deposit.
Man, you talked about just the fear of failure that's so paralyzing. And then just the questions that you had to process of, I'm going to be this failed pastor.
Yeah.
No one's going to come because I was this failed pastor, man. The enemy is so good at getting you to question your calling. And I love how, you know, it wasn't an easy process, but from my perspective, looking into what God has done with you, you've allowed God to work in your heart, and you've allowed people, you know, specifically BT and pastors here, to kind of come alongside you. And I think for me, that's one of the best formulas in dealing with failure, even with the feeling of failure. Because maybe like because someone's going to tell you like, bro, that's not your fault. Like, you know, and so but the reality is that the feeling of failure still exists. And so where do you see, like, kind of scripturally, maybe ways that Jesus deals with failure, or ways that you see, like, kind of people coming alongside you from a biblical standpoint of the importance of that to help people overcome failure?
Yeah, so if you look in, I think it's Exodus 18 is what we talked about a little bit earlier. It's just when Jethro came to Moses, right? And he's like, hey, Moses, what are you doing, right? Moses' wife had been with Jethro, and he's like, hey, she shouldn't be here. She should be with you, right? And this was when Moses was trying to judge all the people on his own. He was sitting there judging people from morning to night, and Jethro's like, hey, bro, this isn't good. Like, what you're doing is not good. You think you're making an impact. You think you're being effective.
Because Moses was working
24/7. Yeah, and he's like, hey, this isn't going to work. And he basically kind of, in layman's terms, tells Moses, like, hey, this is going to fail, and you're going to fail, and the people around you are going to hurt because of that.
Wow.
And so it's just the importance of having those people that are there that are going to be willing to look at you and speak truth to you and say, like, hey, this isn't going to work. Like, if you keep going down this path, like, you're going to fail. I remember one of my mentors, during that time after all that happened, he came and he saw me and he looked me straight in the face and he said, Matthew, you did not fail. Like, and that was something that I held on to throughout the process. He's like, this is not your fault. This was the decision of, you know, this church and the leadership. Like, this is not on you. And so it took him reminding me and reminding myself all through the process, like that failure is a moment.
Yeah.
Right. It's not a person. It's not a lifetime thing.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yes, like, now that's a part of my story, but it's a moment in my story where I felt like a failure, but I had to remind myself that, hey, God is still good. He's better, right? And it took that moment of failure for me to realize, now that I can look back and see that God used that failure to kind of build and mold me into the man of God I am today.
That's good.
You know what I mean? And to know that there's going to be situations that are out of my control, that I may feel like I lost everything, but really what I realized at the bottom of that was that even though it felt like I lost everything, I still had God, and that was all I needed.
Yeah, that's
right?
good.
And like it's just in that moment, you know what I mean, that you feel that.
And going back to what you said earlier, like so much of what we feel as failure, it comes from like kind of cultural perspective.
Yeah.
And I think when we focus on not just momentary failure, but even momentary success, when that becomes our focus, we then are led by our emotions. Like if we're momentary successful, then we're gonna think that we can do it all. But then we're momentary failures, then we're gonna be paralyzed by the things that we can do. And our hope is that our foundation is on Jesus, not on the things that we can do or things that we were unable to do, because then that becomes our identity versus having our identity in Christ.
Yeah, we just do everything in our power, right, to make sure, right? But then we rely on God for the rest, right? Like, knowing that He is good. And
I actually was listening to a podcast once, and Jeff Bezos, who CEO of Amazon, he said that he didn't like keeping up on Amazon stock while he was like controlling the company, because he didn't want to base the value of the company on how they were doing in the stock market. And I was like, that kind of threw me off. I just feel like somebody like him would want to know exactly how they're doing, but it was like he didn't want to be led by his emotions. Going back to Exodus 18, what Jethro tells Moses is you cannot do it alone. What you're going to do is, if you keep doing this, you're going to end up like a failure, which I love that. But then he also says, put other people around you, and then you'll be able to endure. When I look at that story, one thing that I love looking at is Moses hadn't failed yet, but he was probably on the path to failure by overworking himself. And the beautiful thing about that story is Jethro was actually Moses' father-in-law. And it's funny that Jethro saw that Moses was neglecting his family for ministry, which family needs to be our first ministry type of thing. And it was somebody who loved Moses enough to tell him, you have to change what you're doing, otherwise you're going to fail. And so going back to kind of what happened with your story in BT is that Moses had somebody to come around him to say, hey, let me help you right now. And let me show you what your trajectory might look like. And it's that willingness to listen to somebody that loves you to help push you forward to what God has for you, I think. And I love that happened with you, because who knows what was going to happen. But now on this side of things for you, bro, it's like you have no idea how God's going to use your story. He's using it now for you to pastor BT Alice, but you have no idea how He's going to use it in the future for maybe someone else who walks through this and they come along your path, and you're going to be able to share some wisdom with them. And so kind of last question, how would you pastorally counsel someone who's maybe on the path to failure or dealing with failure right now?
Man, I would just kind of encourage them, right? Again, like failure is not who you are, right? It's a moment. And so trying to help them and encourage them to see past this moment, right? Wow. Maybe what are some good things that came out of this moment, right? I can look back and say, yeah, that's a part of my story, right? But before that moment, there was good things that were happening in my life. You know what I mean? That's where I grew to become the leader, that I am today. Learned, to do some things, learn not to do some things. You know what I mean? And so the way, pastoring them through that is just encouraging them and getting them to see themselves through God's eyes, right? And not through their own, right? Not looking at the situation around them, right? But looking at the God who's over the situation.
That's good.
Right? And encouraging and holding on to His word and speaking those promises over yourself, right? And knowing that you are the head and not the tail, like always kind of encouraging them in that and making sure they understand that failure is not who they are.
Wow.
Right? It's a moment. And what does the scripture say? Like we're basically kind of like a vapor, right? We're here one minute and gone the next. And so that's what failure is, right? It's kind of a blip on the radar. Like, oh, that hurt. Okay. Like, let's keep moving forward. And not to allow the failure to define them, right? But to see God in everything and in that situation and what happened, right? Because I can look back and see my story and see where the moment where I felt like a failure and say, man, but in that moment, that was probably, besides now, was when I was the closest to God, right? Ever, was because I needed Him.
That's good.
Right? I needed to look at Him. I needed to be in His presence. And so it was one of those things where you can look back and say, okay, hey, yeah, there's failure, but in your midst of your failure, like focus on Jesus, right? Find people who care more about your soul than care about what the agenda they have for you, right? And so knowing that, right, pastoring somebody through that, like knowing and saying like, hey, we care more about your soul than we do about what you can do for us. And so let me help you and lead you through this failure, and knowing, again, that it's just a moment, right? It's not who you are.
Yeah.
You hear people all the time say, man, I'm such a failure. Man, I'm such a failure. Like, no, you're not, bro. Like, you're loved by God, right? He's got big plans for you. It's not just a cliche thing we say. Like, it's the truth. You know what I mean? If you would just surrender your life to Him, surrender your plans, surrender your goals to Him, right? You're never a failure if you have Jesus, right?
Wow,
the Bible says we're victors, right? And so we walk in that victory. And so holding on to that. And so really, I guess, the way we would pastor somebody dealing with failure is reminding them who they are in Christ. Right, remember who loved them first. Reminding them of that, and so
that's good, man. Matt, appreciate you joining in on today's episode of the podcast. Loved hearing your story. Loved hearing your passion for the city of Alice, and just kind of how you've allowed God to work through you. To me, that's very motivational and encouraging. And man, I'm praying for you, praying for Alice, and we do believe that God has big plans, and He's doing big things right now. But He's going to continue to do that as well, Matt. So appreciate your time, bro, and thank you so much for joining this conversation.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me.